I'm going to ask Hilary Holmes to address us. Hilary Holmes.
Right. I was so focused on the chairs, I didn't notice the stuff. Thank God, that's just water. Yeah, so there you go, that's me. Good evening. What I'm going to do is provide an overview of some of the patterns of human rights violations that we've been documenting, and it will certainly echo some of what's already been said, and anticipate, I'm sure, more things that will be said this evening. So I don't know how many of you read today's Globe and Mail, but there was an article about the elections there, and there were a couple of quotes that caught my eye. Both were directed at the media by a presidential candidate. You can probably guess which one. And here they are. The first one was, "Get behind the strategic goal and protect the Egyptian state." The second one was, "It is better to whisper in the ears of officials about a problem than to make a big noise about it." And the meaning of these is clear for freedom of expression in Egypt. It doesn't exist. There's no place for criticism. Don't challenge the narrative that is out there right now. The same candidate also expressed caution about the pace of democratic reforms. Perhaps 25 years might get there. Change, admittedly, takes time, but we can only hope that was a misquote. Sadly, I really don't think it was. I expect many of you were on Parliament Hill in February 2011, February 12th. It was a global day of action that became a rather spontaneous celebration after Mubarak resigned. He resigned the day before. And how many of you were there, by the way? You missed a great party, the rest of you. I've never seen Pyramid Cake. It was great. The rendition of waving flag was unique, and I'll never forget it. But it was this sort of feeling of incredible hope, and I've been in a lot of demonstrations over the years in a lot of places, and that was a very unforgettable afternoon. So for me and so many others, what's happening right now in Egypt, sort of 3 years later, is a real betrayal of what we were feeling that afternoon. It's an incredible betrayal of that hope. And sadly, human rights violations are again on the increase. None of the presidential candidates, interestingly, of course, have pledged any human rights reforms or any action to hold anyone accountable for any abuses that have happened recently or in the past. The security situation in Egypt, as we all know, is fragile and indeed deteriorated in the months following the ousting of Morsi. Army checkpoints, security personnel, government buildings, they've all come under attack. Hundreds have reportedly been killed. Attacks have also been directed at ordinary citizens. And from our point of view, it's the responsibility of the state to protect the security of people, to protect the right to life, and to bring anyone responsible for attacks to justice. In particularly arbitrary attacks, but any attacks. However, in doing this, any government, Egypt included, must not use this as an excuse for a crackdown on freedoms of expression, peaceful assembly, and association. But that's exactly what we're seeing, as some of the speakers have already said. The figures, everyone's got slightly different figures, but we know that at least 1,400 people have died in protests and political violence. There have been other deaths outside of those contexts. Thousands of people are languishing in detention. We've received new reports of torture and other ill treatment in police stations and prisons, including military prisons, as well as deaths in custody. We're particularly concerned about conditions of detention that have amounted to enforced disappearance, secret detention, because what happens in that context is forced confessions, and where they're used during the grossly unfair trials we've also been documenting, where civilian courts have sentenced hundreds of people to death. Military courts have tried journalists for criticizing the army. We're really concerned about the mass trials where everyone's under the same charge, but there's little or no actual evidence of individual criminal responsibility in that context. And as we know, some of these trials have resulted in hundreds of death sentences, which may or may not change, but that is not a good situation. The authorities have arbitrarily restricted freedoms of expression, association, and assembly, and this kind of widening crackdown that is targeted both supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood and others who are critical of the interim authorities. Now, as I said before, criticism is just not on. This has included journalists, political activists, and human rights organizations. In this context, of course, we're really concerned about the continued sort of efforts to suppress the work of human rights organizations. They're the ones that help us document the violations, who shut them down. You know, we're never going to be a big fan of that. So what we're seeing is sort of unreasonable restrictions on registration, funding, activities, you know, drafting of legislation that will further curtail freedom of expression, and a lot of crackdowns on the activities. You know, including last week, the Egyptian Center for Economic and Social Rights was raided for the second time. 15 people were detained. A lot were beaten up in this context. There were allegations of sexual violence in this situation as well, as part of a broader pattern that we see repeating. As I said, that's the second time in 6 months that they've been raided. We're also seeing sort of broader new restrictions imposed on freedom of assembly. Last November, many of you will probably know, there was a new law limiting protests. It gives the Interior Ministry very wide-ranging powers over demonstrations, forcing organizers to register what they're doing 72 hours in advance of staging any demonstration. It also has given broad powers to disperse demonstrations. You know, so this is what we're seeing happening, whether it's political groups or human rights groups. A lot of the time, are being dispersed, including through excessive use of force. And ironically, this has involved protests about the protest law being dispersed. A lot of that's what's been in the media. There's some other violations that haven't been in the media that I really want to mention. One is the continuing sort of forced evictions of people, leaving them homeless. The forced return of refugees and asylum seekers, including people who fled the conflict in Syria, being returned back. And discrimination and violence against women and minorities. And Mobina, just moments ago, spoke very eloquently about the patterns of violations we're continuing to see there, including the women being targeted around Tahrir Square. And again, the portrayal of the hope and promises made to them. I really want to thank you for your comments. So instead of accountability for the human rights violations, what we're seeing is the granting of further powers that will just pave the way to further abuses. This new law on protests is really concerning because it authorizes the use of lethal force, firearms, against peaceful protesters. They're also finalizing new counterterrorism legislation. We're really concerned about the patterns that we see here because in practice it's likely to be targeted against government opponents. It's really undermining safeguards against arbitrary arrest and torture and expanding the scope and application of the death penalty. We've also seen sort of new Constitution championed, but at the same time, the safeguards that are in there around torture are being routinely disregarded. So really wondering about the value of that document. In this context, we're really concerned about the ongoing and resumed arms sales to Egypt. Part of it is around the equipment used to control protests, so tear gas and so on. The EU had called for a ban on this equipment. We're worried that the elections will sort of give cover to returning to normalcy, resume these. As was mentioned earlier, the Obama administration is looking to normalize relations again. That includes resuming, over $600 million worth of military aid, although there are some people in the U.S. Congress that are trying to block this. So, just to end on the note that neither the new government or Egypt partners should use the fact that there are elections happening yet again as a cover to return to business as usual, because business as usual is just yet another cycle of repression and human rights violations. We're calling on whatever the new government is to uphold human rights. What this means is ending impunity, providing justice for the victims and their families, making sure investigations take place, making sure they're impartial, and making sure they're public. We're also really concerned that Egypt hasn't allowed access to a lot of UN special mechanisms, the human rights experts and the special procedures. They've been waiting for years to get into the country to document violations. They really need to be allowed in now. And the international community, including Canada, needs to support this. Thank you.